Thank you, Dr. Carson. In the interest of time, we're going to temporarily jettison the Q&A and go directly into the panel discussion, after which there will be a Q&A session. So we'll fold in the Q&A both for the keynote speakers and for the panel. We have a very diverse panel today with Kevin Andrews, who is with the Boston Alliance of Charter Schools, Tom Gosnell from the American Federation of Teachers, Barbara Mataloni from the Massachusetts Teachers Association, and Gerard Robinson, the Black Alliance for Educational Options Action Fund. The moderator of the panel is Dr. Raymond Arsenault. Dr. Arsenault is the John Hope Franklin Professor of Southern History and Chair of the Department of History and Politics at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg. He also is a native of Cape Cod. So this is something of a homecoming.
Yeah.
And I bet you got the same expressions of gloom and doom when you told your friends in South Florida that you're coming up to Boston as Dr. Carson got. Talk about masochists coming from Los Angeles to Boston, coming from Southern Florida to Boston this time of year. Dr. Arsenault is the author of 4 award-winning books, including Freedom Riders, 1961, and The Struggle for Racial Justice, and the Sound of Freedom, Marian Anderson, the Lincoln Memorial, and the Concert That Awakened America. His Freedom Riders served as the basis for the 2010 American Experience documentary, Freedom Riders, which won 3 Emmys and a George Peabody Award. I present you Dr. Raymond Arsenault.
Well, I guess I should continue this climatic theme of coming here to the snowy deep north, I guess we might call it. I've actually had a lot of fun the last couple of days. I was down on the Cape visiting my mother's twin sister and then out into the Berkshires, and I didn't drive into any snowdrifts at all, so I'm sort of stunned. I'm really pleased to be here, and it is sort of a nice homecoming, sort of reflecting on what we were going to do this morning, and coming up here to Massachusetts reminded me, I think it was about 1982, it was January, and I was already in St. Petersburg, Florida, and I was the host introducing Senator George McGovern. And I was a thrill to meet him, and it was January. By that time he was back in the Dakotas, and so I introduced him, and then he got up and he said it was so wonderful for him, first of all, to be in Florida in January, out of a blizzard, and to be introduced by a man from Massachusetts, the only state that had supported him in 1972. So I felt like I was the man of the moment for him, at least. Clay was saying about, he always thinks about what Dr. King would say on these things, and it's inevitable, I think, when we have a chance to get close to, as Clay has, so close to Dr. King and his legacy. And in my case, it was the great historian John Hope Franklin, who died in 2009, and I'm very fortunate to hold a chair named for him. And I think back to what John Hope would think about things, and he of course had an amazing educational history. He grew up in Renniesville, Oklahoma, in a one-room schoolhouse, and made his way to Fisk and then to a PhD at Harvard, and changed the face of American history, and really essentially invented African American history as a field, and was probably the most extraordinary individual that I've had the privilege of meeting in my lifetime. And I also think about the Freedom Riders that I've spent so much time with over the last 15 years, interviewing them, trying to tell their story. And I must say, I don't know that I ever remember any of them talking about charter schools specifically, or maybe even about teachers' unions, but the issues that we're going to talk about, that the panel is going to talk about and discuss, I think is very close to what the Freedom Riders did back in 1961. If you think about it, educational opportunity, I think there's a real consensus that this is an important goal of the civil rights movement and the African American freedom struggle, that educational opportunity is a key to any hope that we might have of attaining a true democracy or social and economic equity. So certainly the Freedom Riders that I've written about and gotten to know, I think they understood this, and they continue to understand it. After I finished my book, I spent a year tracking all of them down for an appendix to see, well, what happened to these people who were so brave and courageous and dared the Ku Klux Klan to stop them from sitting in the front of the bus or getting a cup of coffee at a white lunch counter. And it was amazing to me. I guess the lesson I learned is that they signed on for life. It was never really about the buses. I mean, they wanted to desegregate the buses and the terminals, but they were after. They had much bigger fish to fry, and they were still troublemakers. In the best sense of the word, they're still part of the movement. I think it was last year or so, I got a call from Vancouver, British Columbia, from a Canadian Broadcasting Company, and they were actually calling from the jail in Vancouver, and they had 3 women there they just arrested, and they told me, so these women say they know you. And I said, well, who are they? And they were 3 former Freedom Riders, and I said, well, I'm not surprised at all that you've got them behind bars. They had organized the Raging Grannies anti-war movement, so I keep running into stories like that. They're all still out there causing the best kind of trouble. If you look at their lives after the Freedom Rides, in their lives and careers, I think many of them became involved in educational reform, broadly conceived, and activities designed to give young people, especially African American youth, a real chance in life. I was amazed at that, how many of them sort of transformed their passions into things involving education. I think part of the connection between the Freedom Rides and educational reform is the need and the desire to tell the Freedom Rider story. So it's a part of the civil rights struggle. It's an important story, an inspiring tale of courage and empowerment. And I think the Freedom Rides remind us of the power of contingency. That's not a word we use very much anymore. The power of contingent events, of one thing affecting another. But if you think about it, contingency really talks about the possibility of change. I think many of us have our moments where we feel impotent in the force of these massive social and economic forces, that we shrug our shoulders. What can I do? What can we do? It's hopeless. The world's a mess. Let's party. But the Freedom Riders didn't party. They against all the odds, with no realistic expectation of success, these were young kids who were defying their parents and their teachers and their elders and their ministers, who thought they were crazy. They were going to get themselves killed by getting on those buses. They wouldn't listen. They didn't want freedom later. They wanted freedom now. And I think that story tells us that if you have enough courage and conviction and commitment, you can change the world, that so-called ordinary people can do extraordinary things. So that's one thing I think connects any lessons we might want our children and grandchildren to learn. There's also the direct connection, I think, between the Freedom Rides and educational reform, not as a subject to be studied in a history class, but also as a force for the democratization of all institutions, including our schools. In other words, educational reform as a pathway to freedom. I think that's what Clay was talking about in Sapphira. So fostering the implementation of the 1954 Brown desegregation decision was a big part of this, but there was a deeper and broader belief in educational opportunity and equity that I think transcended formal desegregation. So how do charter schools fit into all of this, and teachers' unions? To what extent does the charter school movement represent an extension of the civil rights movement? I think there's been some suggestion here that we might think it in those terms. How do charter schools fit into the broader dream of democratization and expanding opportunity? And I think more specifically, I think on some of our minds certainly, how does the charter school issue intersect with these ongoing battles and controversies related to vouchers, to testing, to the Common Core, to the place and power of teachers' unions, to the conservative political philosophy of privatization, to the No Child Left Behind Act, and of course the new race to the top of the Obama administration, to the technological proliferation of virtual schools. There's so many things that intersect here that I hope we'll be able to talk about. When we consider the overall well-being of public education in the United States, I think this is the question I'd like to hope we have some way of answering this morning. Has the creation of charter schools done more good than harm? More specifically, what types of charter schools and under what conditions and rules of implementation have done the most good or the most harm? I think the answers to these questions, maybe it's good that Clay has come from California and I've come from Florida, to give a little bit of geographic diversity here. The answers to these questions, which we'll discuss and debate in a moment, I think may depend on what part of America we're talking about, what state or city we choose to emphasize. And I think the best example is that from what I've read, Massachusetts has some of the most successful charter schools in the country. And where I come from in Florida, we have perhaps the worst, or some of the worst charter schools in the United States, that the experiences seem to be worlds apart. Whatever you're doing right here, we're doing wrong, I think, in Florida, at least to some degree. So I can at least bring you some balance in the narrative, if nothing else. Just very briefly, and I'll turn it over to the panel for our first question. In Florida, the situation looks very different with respect to charter schools. And we have a wide range of schools and experiences, but I think overall the results of the charter school creation have been discouraging and damaging to the quality of public education in Florida. And I think much of the problem rests in the huge expansion of for-profit. We have almost all for-profit charter schools in Florida. They have very close ties, in some cases, to rather rapacious real estate developers. It's been used as an extension of the kind of real estate boom. And you may have seen the recent article in the New Yorker by Alec McGillis profiling Jeb Bush's policies. He, of course, was present at the creation of the first charter school, the Liberty City Charter School in Miami in 1996. And through his gubernatorial administration and, of course, since, he's been very, very active in promoting charter schools. I think he's also been a critic as well of some of the things that have happened in Florida. But more than 80% of our schools are for-profit. And the test data is very mixed. At the elementary level, it seems to be slight improvements over the mainstream public schools, but at the high schools, there's been a definite decline. And so we've got a lot of soul-searching to do in Florida about whether these charter schools are a good thing or not. But they are exploding in terms of the number of them, particularly in South Florida and Central Florida, where I live. So there's just some thoughts. And we have a set of questions that we'd like the panelists, this wonderful panel, to talk about. And I think maybe the first one, in the interest of time, according to Stanford's Credo and other national researchers, student achievement at Massachusetts charter schools is generally outstanding. But the charter school record across the country is much more uneven. If so, why hasn't the teacher union resistance to charters in Massachusetts lessened? And why hasn't the national charter record been more consistent? So that's quite not a yes-no question anyway. So I'm not sure who would like to begin. Maybe on the far right?
Okay.
I didn't mean far right politically, I just meant far right.
I'm the far left. The high school I went to said, when you give a presentation, stand up. So that's why I'm standing up. I'm Tom Gosnell, president of the American Federation of Teachers in Massachusetts. Just a few words about myself. I am a Latin teacher, and consequently I have a long view of history. It goes back a couple of thousands of years. Secondly, I started teaching in 1964 in the city of Boston, so I have a long perspective on education in Massachusetts. I would point out on this issue one other fact first. You know, Massachusetts public schools are #1 in the nation on the national NAEP tests. Keep that in mind. On the international science and math tests, we are #1 in the Western world. Okay? In the regular public schools, all teachers work under collective bargaining agreements. Okay? There is an argument that collective bargaining agreements interfere with ed reform and achievement. Okay? In Alabama and Mississippi, and nothing against the boys and girls there, or my colleagues there, but they generally finish in the bottom of the national tests. There is not one teacher who works under a collective bargaining agreement. So those are important facts to note, and they have to be kept in the broad discussion and the broad perspective of the issues here. I cannot speak to charter schools in any other part of the United States. I can only focus on Massachusetts. And I do know that there are charter schools in Massachusetts that do quite well. I also know that there are charter schools in Massachusetts that do not do so well. The difficulty, I think, for those of us who are committed to the regular public schools is the fact that charter schools are so limited in the population that they serve. And that is a major, major problem. I want to point out the high level of poverty. We don't address that issue. Our girls and boys in public education are being cheated because of poverty, and we don't address it. And one of the ways we try to deal with it is to create some other options, but they don't go to the heart of it, colleagues. The heart of it is we have to address the poverty in which these boys and girls frequently live. They deserve better than we're giving them. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. I'm going to take this off here. Helmet that.
Just move it closer to you.
Yeah, sure. So I just want to speak to a couple of things, and I'd like, as I'm speaking, to just sort of reflect back on Dr. Carson's comments about the question of who gets left behind. I really appreciate that frame, and I think it's a critical frame for us to take into this conversation. And Dr. Shuttlesworth used the phrase, the least, the lost, and the left behind. And I think as we look at what charter schools have done, including here in Massachusetts, we need to be thinking about the least, the lost, and the left behind. What we know, as my colleague Tom Gosnell has just pointed out, is that students in Massachusetts, charter schools in Massachusetts, have significantly lower percentages of English language learners and children with special needs relative to regular public schools. That's clear. We also know from a report, and this is from a report that actually MTA did on the Boston charter schools, that there's nowhere near the same percentage of English language learners and special needs students. So I was thinking about that in terms of sort of this two-tiered system that we've created. And what does it mean as individuals committed to civil rights, and thinking about Dr. King, and he was not only assassinated because he was there with the unions, but because he had spoken not long before at Riverside Church about the intersection between racism, capitalism, and militarism. And he was understanding that there was something important going on here about the dangers to the people in charge, about collective action and commitment to the common good, to the least, the lost, and the left behind. And part of what's disturbing about that in terms of charter schools is that what it looks like as you look at the data is not only that they don't just happen to serve students who are English language learners and students with special needs, but the data suggests that those students are being pushed out. As a matter of fact, in a recent report from the Program on Human Rights and the Global Economy at Northeastern University School of Law, quote, they say in Boston during the 2012-2013 school year, students in charter schools were almost 3 times more likely to be subject to suspension, permanent expulsion, or removal to alternative facilities than students in traditional Boston public schools. The least, the lost, and the left behind. Who are those students? Where do they end up? What are the services that they're getting? The other thing that is a critical piece here in Massachusetts, and it is becoming more dramatic over time, is what it means in terms of the funding that leaves the schools and goes with the students. And again, I'll quote the Northeastern Law School study. The ongoing expansion of the charter sector, along with the accompanying pressure on public school budgets, undermines the ability of some local districts to preserve and protect the rights of the larger group of children remaining in the public schools. The least, the lost, and the left behind. I became a public school teacher because I was committed to social justice, to anti-racist work, and public schools as the place where we grow the possibility of democracy. Charter schools are deeply undemocratic. Public schools are where we grow democracy. You want to enter our political system? What do people say? Go run for school committee. That's where the democracy lives in our community. And that's where, in our schools, where children come together from all kinds of places, we grow empathy, we grow a sense of community, and a sense of being committed to the greater good. Not to just our individual well-being, but to the greater good. Charter schools, by creating a two-tiered system, by leaving students behind, and by undermining the public support, both in democratic elections and in funding for public schools, undermine the possibility of our democracy and the critical fight that we all need to continue to engage in for economic and racial justice. Thank you.
Wrong. Here we go again. Elridge Cleaver once said, yeah, that's where I'm coming from. There is no more neutrality in this world. You either have to be part of the solution or you are part of the problem. And this is here exactly where we go again. I see many friends here from my public school days as a union president, and many friends here from charter schools. I think of Kwame Ture, Fannie Lou Hamer, H. Rap Brown, Bobby Seals, and our own Bob Moses here. And what would they say about this discussion about charter schools and how they're not serving English language learners? But they fail to put out that there is a lottery system. Charter schools do serve, and our numbers are growing in ELL. But they don't point out that from Central America, where the children come, they come at different times of the year. They don't point out that, and that is one of the reasons that charter schools can't really enroll those. There's a lottery system that prevents us to do that. Now that's the state. We can change that law, and we'd be happy to take more ELL students. And I'm sure the next argument is we do not serve special education students. Here again, wrong. We do serve special education students. But I will say this to my colleagues to my left and my right, that yes, we can do more in charter schools in this area. And that is the difference, is we are not looking for a fight. We are looking for serving children, primarily black and Latino children, children who look like me. So I'm here to tell you that as charter schools, we're willing to collaborate. I can talk to you about the Credo report and pointed out that why we serve and why we are one of the leading schools, period, district or charter, that are serving black children and are closing the achievement gap. The achievement gap in charter schools is about 9 to 10%. But if you look at the public schools, it's in the 30s. Now that's dramatic. So I have a real concern when we're talking about that charter schools, which are public schools, are not serving English language learners and special needs. Let's point out all the facts. Let's point out the barriers. But let's try to be collaborative in our effort instead of dividing. We can no longer, Martin Luther King will not want this kind of division. He was a man about unity. It is unity to diversity. There are no two charter schools that look alike. There's the Conservatory Laboratory School that has a very strong arts focus. There's Bridge Boston that has a very focus on foster children and homeless children. There's Phoenix Academy that looks at children who are dropping out of school. There's City on the Hill Charter School that has a high school performance. There are many charter school leaders in here who look at the diversity of that we have in this community and addressing that. And we welcome the challenge. But I think the unions got it wrong, and I am in favor of unions. But I think they got it wrong from the very beginning. Instead of attacking charter schools, you should have united with us.
Civil rights is here to stay because the human desire for freedom and the pursuit of happiness has been something that preceded the creation of unions in charter schools. So that's here. Teacher unions are here to stay. The desire for people to collectively bargain and get together to make sure that their desires are known to those in power will remain, and it preceded what we know now as a creation of unions. Charter schools are here to stay because it's simply the latest articulation in a 100-year evolution of people desiring to have different types of educational models available to their children who may learn differently or simply want an opportunity. For me, civil rights and teacher unions have gone hand in hand. When you take a look at Dr. Martin Luther King and the movement for civil rights in the South, it was teacher unions and traditional, what others would say were blue-collar type unions who worked to support those. It was the American Federation of Teachers who desegregated before NEA to make sure that there was a push to desegregate and integrate its teaching role and played a role in making sure that civil rights was on the forefront. We know that the National Education Association merged with the American Teachers Association, which in a previous life was the National Negro Teachers or Colored Teachers Association, to make sure there was a push. So teacher unions and civil rights have gone hand in hand. The question is, where did the line of demarcation for educational opportunity come up when all of a sudden charter schools became on the scene? Aren't charter schools similar to magnet schools? They're both public schools, theme-based, providing an opportunity coming out of the civil rights movement. Surely magnet schools coming out of a deal that President Richard Nixon had to then cut as president with the solidly Democratic South to make sure that integration, school desegregation, neighborhood schools and busing took place. Why is it when we talk about alternative schools that came out of the civil rights movement, open classrooms and others, no same level of righteous indignation heaped upon those, and yet when we have charter schools, we now want to question whether it's going to be a problem for social justice, or are we really talking about when we reform schools? We talk about social justice, but at the end, we always deem the kids who left behind are not the social justice leaders, but just us.
Thank you. Well, it's a shame we don't have any differences of opinion or creative tension here, but I guess we'll go on anyway. Next question. What should Massachusetts lawmakers do, or how should lawmakers address the charter school caps and charter school expansion in urban centers in Massachusetts?
Want to start the same way?
Why not?
Yeah, okay. By the way, thank you for coming. The American Federation of Teachers was one of the leaders in 2014 against expanding the cap on charter schools. And I want to point out, and I think this is a fundamental unfairness, you know, the charter schools are totally focused, I take that back, the charter schools are mainly focused on urban areas or in areas, well, not so much in rural areas, but mainly in large urban areas. These are areas that need all the resources they can get, okay? The public schools, the regular public schools, overwhelmingly educate the majority of students in those areas. They're losing resources. It's a major issue, and there's no way around it. Now, without commenting negatively on charter schools, there is no question that they educate a very small number of the students, yet it has a profound impact on the students in the regular public schools. Let me add one other thing. I want to challenge you all. You know, human rights and civil rights cut across the board. Housing, voting rights, health care, education. They are all interconnected. And I want to give you a challenge. Benjamin Franklin, born around the corner, said there are two certainties in life, death and taxation. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes lived up the street, said taxes are the price of civilization. Okay? Now, I am personally a fan of taxes. The American Federation is a fan of taxes. Our kids living in poverty, the great majority of whom are in the regular public schools, need revenues, need taxes. We want quality education, then we must provide quality support. Thank you.
Well, you know, I couldn't agree more that support for education is critical. And let's look at this and what the legislature has done. They fund, and I think unequally, both the district and charter schools. What the legislature do, it should lift the cap. They should provide more choice, parent choice for parents. That's what this is about. You know, it's interesting that finally, in this country, black and brown families are being the attention of education. Finally, we're paying attention where we should be paying attention. Now, the legislature came up with a system, a formula of reimbursement to the local schools. In other words, a child leaves a district school, goes to a charter school, and because of some cost that have to change, they set up a formula, I think it's 125, 25, 25 percentage. Now, what the legislation has failed to do, has failed to pay that rent. They have not given the public schools the money the agreement that they had. Now, I don't believe in that agreement. I don't believe in paying rent twice. But that was the deal. We supported it, and it's on the legislature as part of the deal of lifting the cap. So I don't know. That's a problem that I think the unions have to go and talk to the Senate and to the representatives. Don't blame us for doing the fine work that we're doing. You just need to go to them, tell them to pay the bill. It's just as simple as that. That's what they need to do, period. Charter schools are here to stay. The cap will be lifted. Just in case people haven't really recognized this, there's a Governor Baker and it's Jim Pizer who are charter school advocates. It eventually is going to be lifted. The question is, how do we pay for these schools? How to make sure that they all get equal funding? I couldn't support that more.
So you'll be surprised to find out that I'd like us to keep the cap on charter schools. And actually, I sort of puzzled by these questions as we were given the questions ahead of time clearly to prepare, and I was like, well, yes, no, you know. So what I'd like to do is sort of think about this as a question, because I think it's incredibly narrow. And I think in how narrow it is, it reveals how narrow our conversation is. And Tom alluded to this, or actually spoke directly to it in terms of, you know, the broader issues of poverty and healthcare, racism, homelessness, the school-to-prison pipeline that was referred to earlier. I am troubled how much we are having a conversation about whether or not we should lift the cap on charter schools, and we're not talking about the number of children in Massachusetts who are homeless. And we're not talking about the economic structures and the institutional racism that helps to create that. I think those are the questions that we should be asking as people who are clearly all dedicated to the children of the Commonwealth and this nation. And that sort of takes me back then to thinking, and no disrespect, but I start to think, well, why are we having a conversation about charter schools and teachers' unions and civil rights? If we're here to talk about civil rights, why aren't we gathering to talk about economic injustice and racism? Why aren't we gathering to talk about Black Lives Matter? I'm like really confused, like honestly confused about that. And I'm an educator, and I know how much education matters. But I'm worried about how narrow the conversation becomes. And then what are the sort of yes and no's that we get going? While in the meantime, we have children and families in this Commonwealth who every day are suffering profoundly because of structural injustice. And the reality is that by talking solely about education, we are not addressing structural injustice. Paul Krugman had a good piece about this 2 days ago in the New York Times. Knowledge is not power. What power is taking the power back from the 1% who have it right now and are undermining broad swaths of the public good and the commons that are central to the possibilities for democracy. And so I'm just going to pivot off of that question and go where I wanted to go anyway. Thank you.
Good answer. Very good. Very good.
I think that civil rights, teacher unions, and charter schools, in fact, is a great broad topic to talk about, because when you look at the origins of charter schools, they were actually created with union support. When you look at Minnesota, the lawmaker who helped push it there pushed the legislation in part because she had union support. When you look at the second state in the nation with a charter law, California, Senator Gary Hart introduced that bill and became law in part because he had support from the union. And as President Birmingham mentioned here, there was support in 1993 for charter schools with union support. So in fact, the origin of this movement never started without the unions being a part of it in the original 3 states where it took place. So I think that's important. Number 2, it's going to be very hard to lift the cap. First of all, I support lifting the cap, let me be clear. But it's going to be hard to lift the cap until we actually lift the crap. And we have to lift the crap off some of the conversations we're having. One of them is, let's not raise the cap because charter schools only serve a small segment of the student population. Your exam schools serve a small segment of the population. And trust me, there's not a line of people wanting to close down Boston Latin. If you look at New York State, another state with a very strong charter governing, let's say, model there, you have exam schools like Bronx Latin. California, you have magnet schools, which serve a very small segment of the population, and yet I don't see any major move there. Please don't let the small segment piece stop us from lifting the cap. I say let's lift the cap, but first of all, let's deal with lifting the crap.
Thank you. The next question I think we should consider. Some consider teachers' unions a barrier to charter schools and education reform. But Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Jersey, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, many of the highest performing states on the NAEP, are places with very strong unions. Is this claim that the teacher unions are obstacles to school reform fair?
Well, we've got an order set up. Okay. Well, I did cite earlier about the NAEP test and the International Science and Math tests. You know, reform is an interesting word because it has so many different meanings. Is class size an issue of reform? Now, who are the leading advocates for class size? Making it smaller. The parents and the unions. Right? The issues of poverty. Do they deal with issues of reform? If we can reform structural poverty, are we reforming public education? Now, unions in general, not just teachers' unions, but across the board, strongly support structural changes to reduce poverty. And let me tell you, that will have a very salutary effect on reform. But let's deal with an issue that those who call themselves reformers make a big deal about. And that's the issue of tenure. In this state, we call it professional status. So they're the same thing. Now, Jamie Gass said in big, bold, underlined letters that we're to keep our remarks short, okay? But the questions could keep us going the entire day. Now look, in this state, to get tenure, professional status, you can't get it till after, basically, I'm simplifying, you can't get it till after 3 years of teaching. Look, if we have well-run school systems, well-run schools, at the end of 3 years, we should know whether a person is competent or not. Something is seriously wrong if an incompetent gets tenure. Seriously wrong in the management of the schools. But is it possible that some point in his career, or her career that a teacher is no longer competent? Of course it is. We would be stupid to deny that. But that has nothing to do with tenure per se. We deal with that issue. We deal with it. Now, we may have disagreements on how to deal with it, but we must deal with it. But given that it takes 3 years in this state to get professional status and tenure, 100% of the teachers in their 4th year should be competent teachers.
Thank you, Tom. Let's put it right here. So the question is, should teachers, about the barrier you asked about.
Yes.
Well, I don't, look it, I would not say that the rank and file of teachers' unions and teachers, my colleagues in the district schools, are a barrier. I think that we, here again, and I appreciate your comments about what we should be talking about. And we should be talking about funding, and we should be talking about the haves and have-nots, and we shouldn't, and it's interesting that in the civil rights movement, it was about black folks, and they convinced that the white poor should not trust the black folks. If the white poor and the black folks got together, and poor folks got together, to understand who was really causing the problem, there would be a change. So I support that effort of the 1%. I understand that. But on the other hand, I think if we are spewing venom that is so negative, all we're doing is recreating the same thing that those who want us, they want us to fight one another. And that's a mistake. I think if the Pioneer Institute or any other group that says, oh, I think it's good, and I don't think this was their intent, that they come in here, oh, let's get these people to just argue with one another and cause more division, is a mistake. I am not a believer, even when I was the union president, of strict tenure. Because I saw some teachers who shouldn't be in the system who should have been gone. I think there should be a reevaluation of tenure. I think tenure, like anything else, should come up for reevaluation in a different form. No one should be guaranteed a job. No one. You need to work and get better at it. So there needs to be a good evaluation system so good teachers can stay within the system. And those who aren't need to move on, because not everybody's right to be a teacher. So I don't see unions per se as a barrier. But I think some of the words that come out prevent us from really working towards what the real problem is. So if that's the theme, then I would suggest that unions should not be the barrier. They should come and want to work together with charter schools.
So I'm thinking I want to change the title, or maybe MTA and AFT have to hold their own summit and invite everyone. I'm thinking about what the title of this program would seem like if it was public education, hedge fund managers, and civil rights. What would the conversation be that we were having? Because the reality is that in New York City, Eva Moskowitz, who has been pushing the charter schools in New York City, is funded by the 1%, by hedge fund managers. And Families for Excellence in Education, planted right here in Boston, funded by hedge fund managers. So I'm saying that, like, so teachers' unions are in the mix somehow, but hedge fund managers who are pushing these so-called reforms are not part of the broader conversation. Are they obstacles to democratic education? Might be a question that I want to ask. Are they creating a two-tiered system that's resegregating our schools? That's a question I might want to ask. So I am always troubled, and as a English teacher of sophomores and as a teacher educator, I always want us to ask, what are the conversations we're not having while we're here? So I want to put that out. And then I just want to speak very quickly, because I managed to miss what Jamie's bold print about keeping our comments short. I didn't have my glasses on, I guess. I think it's really important to remember that unions, and Martin Luther King understood this, without unions we don't have democracy. If you don't have workplace democracy, which is what unions provide us, we don't have a democratic country. Too much of your life then is controlled by other people. So it's important to remember that as we are constantly having unions set up as the problem. I would go back to the idea that it was Schenker who introduced or embraced charters. And I think part of what happened is that people who wanted to crush unions picked it up and decided to use it as a way to crush us, and we need to go. But that's in the discourse now, and it's happening. My last point, or actually my second last point about this is students' learning conditions are teachers' working conditions. There's not a separation there. If we want teachers to do their best work, they need autonomy, they need academic freedom. That's why we need due process protections, which is how I think of tenure. That's what tenure gives you. It gives you the right to have a certain process before you're fired for your job. It gives you legal rights. That's what tenure is. And that protects autonomy and academic freedom. So I think those are key. And the last piece that I won't talk about, I'll just drop a little bomb, is to think about the kind of churn that we see in charter schools of teachers that are in and they're out, and they're in and they're out. That kind of unstable environment can't be good for our children.
The taste is in the pudding. Dr. Shuttlesworth mentioned charter schools in Alabama. In 2008 or 9, I traveled to Alabama with Todd Zebarth, who at the time, well, actually still is VP at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. And we met with the gentleman at the time who was the longest serving NEA state president. I don't remember his name. We went to his office, and he mentioned that he was proud to have marched with Dr. King. And if either one of you two remember his name, I think that's who it is. And he said, I marched with Dr. King. And in fact, his office was across the street from Dr. King's church. And he said, I'm glad you two took time to talk to me about charter schools. I'm against them. And we said, why are you against charter schools? He said, because charter schools will lead to segregation. And I will not support any program that will reverse all the great work that we've done here in Alabama, and particularly my commitment to Dr. King. And I said, so let me see. You're concerned about charter schools leading to white flight. He said, yes. I said, well, having looked at the city demographics, the whites who wanted to fly have flown. I said, number two, you don't want your public school system to revert back to segregation, and yet 91% of your schools are already black. First of all, I don't think we have segregated schools today as we did in 1954. Surely we have racial identifiable schools, but it's a language piece. And we often never mention the fact that over 70% of the students in the United States attend publicly, predominantly white schools where white students are, and we don't call those segregated. And so before we left, he said, thank you, and we didn't move forward. So I've seen that take place. Number two, to go to the president's point, I think it would be good to actually have a conversation about public education, hedge funds, and teacher unions. In fact, we have it right now. It's called your pension investment fund. When you take a look at the Massachusetts Investment Fund, and you take a look at where they invest money for your state employees, which include teachers, 40% of the investments that they have targeted for growth are in the global international index market. That includes emerging markets, that includes domestic, and that includes global. Those are mostly for profit. 10% of your funds are actually invested in hedge funds and what they call alternative assessments, private equity, real estate, hedge funds, and others. So in fact, if you take a look at what's going to ultimately help your teachers retire, it's actually hedge fund money and other money. So you already have it. Thank you.
Dr. Arsenault, may I add?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, it will take less than 1 minute. You know, this will really show my left-wing predilections. I think in the USA, no matter what your field is, everyone should be guaranteed a job. That's part of democracy and the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What should not be guaranteed is acting incompetently on the job.
Thank you.